On the competitive Overwatch subreddit, I noticed there was a lot of discussion about HuK's performance as an analyst at E-League's Overwatch Open. Now, for anyone who's coming from the world of Overwatch and doesn't know who I actually am an E-League analyst myself for CSGO, and in CSGO I've done more than 30 offline events, and Counter-Strike as a franchise, I've been around the game playing it ever since the beta release in '99, and I've been actually working within the field of Counter-Strike as an esport since 2001. So I'm someone who knows a little bit about being an analyst, has been on many desks before, has interacted with pretty much all the different types of analyst and commentator and broadcast person that you can actually have in many of the esports games I've followed for the last 15 or 16 years. So the thread itself that was discussing HuK and whether people like him, whether they don't like him, what they thought his issues were, I actually thought a good way to discuss this topic is actually to highlight a specific moment that really stands out as a problem in how HuK has approached being an analyst in Overwatch. And so I'll link the point in the VOD in the box below because it's from a Twitch VOD. And if I can find it as a YouTube VOD, I'll link it up there. But if it's not, then look in the description box below because obviously you can't link Twitch links in actual annotations as far as I know. So the moment I'm talking about is probably the worst moment. It's probably the best example of the problems that HuK's had as an analyst in Overwatch. And it took place for the analysis desk segment for the Fnatic versus Immortals game. The first game on King's Row in the NA Group B. So what happens is during the analysis segment, they go to the replay as you'd expect, and the analysts are talking over the top of it. And when they're asked, why the Fnatic team was able to win this game, HuK attributes the win to the player Buds from Fnatic, and he calls him the best Reaper in the world. Then HuK himself starts to mention his co-analyst ZP's opinion, which is that ZP thinks IDDQD is a better player. And then ZP comes in, he gives his reasoning as to why, and he bases his reasoning on the history of Fnatic. Now, in doing so, there is a point to make actually, which is that once he mentions the history of Fnatic, HuK, even while he's explaining this history, actually sort of like, you can hear him audibly sigh, and then HuK just says that it's just a cop-out, what ZP just said. He says, I don't believe that, and then he just references again that he thinks this guy is top 2, and mentions that like pro players would think so. Now ZP at that point in time then brings up that there were a lot of tournaments in which that HuK wasn't casting, that IDDQD was fantastic at and was a key player in. Now, I will point out, because it's mostly about HuK, just as a point about ZP, I mean, that is a little bit, the way it's phrased is a little bit condescending. Admittedly, you do have to understand, when people are live on air, they aren't always going to articulate themselves in the most ideal manner. Like, if you're sat on the internet writing a comment now, you can backspace the comment, you can think about the comment for as long as you want before you do it, you can even go back and edit it after the fact. When you're just saying something live in the spur of the moment, you don't have a whole lot of time to edit what you're saying. Like, a lot of that's like experience as to how well you can get what you were thinking out and articulate it well. And then also, if you fuck up slightly or you slightly misword something, unless you have a lot of time, you kind of have to just go with it. You can't really just edit it on the fly and be, oh, well, what did I actually meant to say? Like, there's not time for that. You've got a very limited amount of time. You want to get in quality analysis. You want to get back and forth, etc. So with that said, when ZP then makes that comment about how he knows HuK didn't cast a load of those lines, that is a bit condescending on his part. I mean, the implication there, which I imagine is what HuK took from it, and why HuK then gets a bit upset or a little bit tilted, is the implication is that since HuK didn't cast those tournaments, that maybe he also didn't watch those tournaments since he disagrees with ZP, which obviously doesn't necessarily carry. I mean, that's not necessarily the case whatsoever. Like, HuK might have done research and then offer his analysis and watched those games. HuK might have watched those games from home. Certainly doesn't follow that because he didn't cast them, he doesn't have that information. So not really the greatest point as to why. Like, ZP would have been better off if he did just kept, like, if he did ignored the fact that HuK didn't cast the games and just said that there were a lot of tournaments where IDDQD was fantastic, in contrast to this one, maybe list a couple of them or list like a key match that comes to mind. That would be a better way to make the same point, essentially. Like, the way he said it wasn't terrible necessarily, but I can understand the underlying kind of grey area that HuK could then read into. Because HuK then retaliates by saying that ZP can't play the game at HuK's level and calls his thoughts gold insights, to which ZP then comes back and says that, HuK hasn't beaten Tailspin offline and refers to a Tribes match that he played in. Now, first and foremost, to be fair, this segment is less than 2 minutes in length. Like, this isn't like a 20-minute thing of them going back and forward, telling total strips of each other. But with that said, for a 2-minute segment, I have to say, this is complete shit. on all levels, analysis, entertainment, just presenting a show in the fucking game, total shit. And for a 2-minute segment, one of the worst esports desk segments I've ever seen in 15 years around esports. Now, think about it. Here you have a game that you're going to analyze, okay? This is what the purpose of this segment is, to analyze this point in the game. And you spent most of the segment not analyzing the game, not even analyzing the player. I mean, you have a juicy, wide open topic like, how good is Buds? Why is IDDQD better than Buds contrasted against him? Or, here you go, who's the best Reaper? Who's the best player? Amazing topics that really insightful experts could get a lot out of, or could put some really good points into, and can maybe even be very concise and just make good points and contrast them against each other. Instead, the majority of the segment is spent with no actual analysis of that fact. Like, HuK starts to do it, but just sort of gives opinions like this guy's just the best and all that sort of thing. Doesn't explain necessarily why. And then him and ZP go back and forth. ZP tries to give some historical context, but then that gets derailed again by HuK with the other shit. So I have to say, even though ZP was the one who made the initial comment that HuK springboarded off, yeah, even if that was a little boost, HuK definitely himself went completely ham after that. So HuK in large part is why this segment got derailed overall. Because he couldn't handle the fact that this guy disagreed with him. And then because he put in this tiny little burn, or at least HuK perceived as a burn, HuK then derailed the whole segment into just being like a him versus ZP aspect that went to shit and was pretty bad. Now, ZP played his part in it, certainly, but HuK was a driving force, the antagonizing force within why that became fairly shit overall as a segment. Now, the sickest part about this, I have to say, if we're analysing it, well, if we're analysing their analysis segment, is that they didn't even really go into what makes those specific players better in the particular context they were talking about, or even against each other. It just descends into shit arguing, which barely qualifies as banter, I have to say. Now, here's the problem with this. It's not funny, it's not witty, doesn't have anything really to offer of merit, and it's just low-level dick measuring, basically. Now, what's funny is, coming from CSGO, we're the game that's mainly defined as the banter game, where our analysis desks have a lot of jokes, have a lot of banter between each other, have a lot of, like, fake insults, etc. But you know what? In general, it nearly always has to have actual merit, the banter in CSGO. It's not just meaningless. It's not just pointless filler. It's not just pointless self-aggrandization. Like, it has to be funny. So, for example, it has to have some creativity to it, or a clever quality to it. So, yeah, you're bantering, but there's something clever about it, or the way it ties into something, or it's a funny 1-2 as a joke, and it's all understood as entertainment in that sense. It has to be funny. I mean, we're talking about funny not only as a joke, yeah, that's the creativity part, etc., but it also has to be in the spirit of fun. The idea that even if you're wrecking the guy, you are wrecking the guy. Like, you're not really wrecking him, you're not really shitting on him. You're doing it in a way where it's like, like one wink to the audience, like, oh, I know this guy's not really shit, but I'm just going to fuck with him a bit now. Like, haha, that's my persona, this is his persona, let's go at him a little bit. Like, that's fine. That isn't what this segment was. Another thing is, you never undermine the other guy you're working with. As in, never imply in a non-joking manner that he's shit in any way. I mean, I realise, you have to understand, if you know HuK's personality, he might have meant to some degree that, like, the gold insights bit wasn't serious. But the problem is, it does come a little bit... I think there's a grain of truth to that. And I think the fact that HuK didn't like the fact this guy disagreed with him, and the fact that HuK can't handle the fact that he then suggests that HuK maybe didn't watch something. HuK, like, does kind of believe that, like, the pro players know better than the others. Now, HuK does kind of, like, think that if you disagree with them, then you don't know the game well enough, or you didn't watch this well enough, or you're just deluded, etc. He does kind of... I think there is a grain of truth to that, so that's a problem. He didn't even... If it's true that it's supposed to be jokes and banter, he didn't sell that very well. That's another aspect. So you never undermine that, and you definitely never make out like the guy you're working with is shit. You never do that, because that's destroying the team itself. And you are a team, that's the key point. And as a corollary to that, in describing that they're shit, you never ever imply with a legitimate amount of truth to it, or in a manner that the audience will take as truth, that the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Because your whole job, both of you, is that you're analysts, and that to some degree you're experts on presenting reasonable information, accurate information, crafted opinions from a mind that knows what it's talking about. You never cut away at that and fuck with that, because that fucks with the broadcast and the legitimacy of your desk crew. Even if you're the star player and if you're the star analyst, you're the one who knows the most. This is a team you're on, and you've got to work out your role within that team. You've got to work with this guy and his strength. You never fuck with it like he shouldn't even be there and he's nothing compared to you and he doesn't know anything. That doesn't big you up. It fucks with the whole desk and the legitimacy and credibility of the desk and the actual, like, production itself. Speaking of which, in general, even if you're fucking with the guy, even if you're disagreeing with him, you still disagree while working as a team. You allow him some room to have his opinion, you give your counterpoint, you maybe even put a little burn in on that, but you have counterpoint, you put a little burn in. Also, you know when to let it go. Like, for example, if that guy wrecks you with a really good line, if it doesn't fit the going on analysis of the game, it can't just be people going backwards and forwards with banter and shitting on each other constantly like 4 or 5 times. It has to be, sometimes one of you has to take a loss and go, you know what, later on, there'll be a moment where I get the good line in and then he'll drop at that point. You have to do it all for the benefit of the show, ultimately. To put forward the best product. It's not about your own little ego at this point in time. Your ego has to be subservient to the show and doing the best. Now, sometimes that means you get to give the line and have the cool line and get the applause from the audience, as it were. Other times, it means you're on the receiving end of the line. I've done this many times myself. I mean, famously, the last major we had, the last World Championship for CSGO, ESO1 Cologne, there was a segment where at the end of the segment, the host, Machine, a guy that I know a little bit, I've worked a couple of events with him now, but I'm not super good friends with him, because I made a joke at him because he always has to plug the Score Esports. When he was plugging the Score Esports, later on, somehow in the banter, I made a joke along the lines of, like, I'll go and, like, he doesn't, I can't remember what the initial genesis of it, like, he didn't know something, so I'll go and, like, make an article about him and something else for the Score, and then his retort was, like, yeah, I'm sure it'll be, like, a 20-minute video with 2 minutes of content, right? Which is obviously a joke at the stereotype of people who don't like my videos and think they're too long or too boring or not concise enough or whatever, even though that's obviously not what I'm aiming for in any way. They're supposed to be long, extended thoughts where I take you through my thought pattern, give you all the little corollary details, lots of little minor details, because that's what this channel's for. But the point of it is, okay, there is a grain of truth to that, and I guess you could say on some level he's wrecking me a bit, but even so, it's not like he wrecks me in a harsh way. I don't take it in a harsh way, and what's more important is, in that moment, he has got a little burn on him here, and so I give him the win. First of all, it's the end of the segment. We don't have time to discuss more. I can't go, well, look, no, you can't end the segment, because you know what, you've only been an analyst for like a month or so. You're shit, yeah, like I don't do a talk like that. You know, in that moment, I realise, you know what, you got to take the loss sometimes. You got to let them have the high moment. You got to move on. We're all a team ultimately. It doesn't matter who takes the hit, who does whatever. It's like fucking wrestling, doesn't it? It doesn't matter who loses the match. You're all on fucking WWE. It's all entertainment. You're all getting paid afterwards. It's not like a real sport in that sense. You're not going at each other in that particular manner. And so people don't realize this even in CSGO, by the way. They think that like he wrecked me in that manner, I couldn't come back. No, in that moment, you have to let it go sometimes. You can't be pedantic for the sake of the desk. You can if you got a little bit of time, or if there's actually some maneuver within what you're going to say in some next analysis to come back at the guy. That would be a way to do it. If you make another point and then drop a little burn in, that might be a way to do it. You know, it takes skill, it takes nuance. You have to really know what you're doing to be able to do this. So that's the point. Ultimately, no matter what, you have to have the mentality that you're working as a team. So even if you disagree, it's got to be within that manner. And certainly, your disagreeing can't get in the way of the other guy making his points. That can't happen, because the show has to be the most important aspect. And in this aspect of being an analyst and experts, it's giving the expert analysis. That has to be the #1 priority. If you can fit jokes or burns around that, okay. Even so, that didn't really work in this sense, because first of all, HuK is way too aggressive in this manner. It's like he's not willing to let that guy disagree with him and then give him chance to disagree. He basically undermines his co-worker, essentially demeans that guy's position as a credible, legitimate analyst, and does it all while live on air, for fuck's sake, on a broadcast that, in theory, people could be watching who don't know much about Overwatch and don't know much about esports in general, and their first impression of this guy is like, you've fucked with him, why should anyone listen to him? He's got gold insights, he's not as good as you at the game. Brilliant, yeah. Like, don't do stuff like that. Now, I will say, again, just to reiterate, it was the ZP was the one who essentially he opened the door for this to happen. He should have actually, in this scenario, if in my opinion, just taken the stupid little hit from HuK and just given his thoughts and won out just by giving the better analysis and let the public decide who won that one. You don't have to fuck with him in that way. That's a little bit petty. Maybe he felt a little bit threatened by how HuK was treating him and how, in general, this isn't just a small issue. There's smaller versions of this have happened throughout HuK's analysis at other tournaments as well. But if I'm the ZP guy, I deal with that backstage. In fact, I'd even go to HuK and let's figure this out, man. Let's figure out what our dynamic's going to be, how we're going to work here. So I will say that, but HuK, the ZP does a very small thing, and HuK takes that and makes it into something much bigger. And it is certainly also the case that even outside of ZP, HuK is portraying himself in this manner where he is, when he's on the desk, the ultimate like expert and the ultimate voice who can't really be like argued with. And if you do, then he'll just go to some low like logical fallacy as to why your argument can't be correct, rather than just making the argument and showing you with his words that he's the best. You don't have to call yourself the best. You can show that you're the best, mate. So, for people who don't know who HuK is, okay, I have to give you a little bit of preface here to understand why he's got this particular attitude in how he's approaching Overwatch. right? This guy was one of the best foreign StarCraft 2 players. Foreign in StarCraft 2 just means anyone not Korean, because Koreans were by far the best region. So for people outside of Korea, he was one of the best. In fact, at one point in time, in 2011, there was like a few months from the summer on where he actually was one of the best players in the whole world, like a top 10 player in the world. Had some really nice Western results, even was doing pretty decently in Korea, like made the top 8 of the best tournament there. He was a very good player. Now, in the latter years, yeah, he fell off a bit. He gradually went downhill, and then over the last 3 or so years, he was terrible, actually. He was okay, like you could have the odd game that was very good, but he was never placing top 8. Even in some of the tournaments that had Westerners in, you just wouldn't have top placings. He was far from what he used to be, but because of what he did early on and then getting signed by Evil Geniuses and then having some early success there, he was able to command one of the highest salaries in the world. So he had a much higher salary than if you started listing off right now the best Korean players of all time. And by the way, they are the best players of all time. MVP, Life, these guys. The GSL champions. HuK made, like, in 1 year of salary, what some of these guys made across their entire careers of salary. And he was doing this 1, 2, 3 years in a row, making these massive salaries. And so, despite the fact he wasn't as good as these guys overall, and for those years of the game, he had an incredibly entitled attitude where he almost got, like, offended if someone suggested he wasn't that good, or if someone lesser than him made a comment along those lines, or he acted as though he deserved that salary in every sense. Now, he did in some ways. Some of those Korean players didn't have the showmanship, didn't have the fan appeal, didn't maybe have as exciting a style, couldn't play for Evil Geniuses for whatever reason. Okay, sure, but he acted very entitled and became very entitled. And the problem is, that actually works if you are the best, okay? A lot of us can accept arrogance or can accept this idea that you're better than everyone if you actually can kind of show it, like you do something brilliant in the game, or you kind of are the best in some way. And so it's like that. It's like the right of kings, right? It comes with it. We expect that kind of aura, that kind of charisma, machismo to come from the best player. The problem is when you're then not the best player anymore and you're getting paid absurdly high amount of money compared to everyone else, you got to be a little bit more humble there. You got to be a bit more gracious, you know. You got to kind of like work with the crowd. Like, yeah, listen, like you guys like me as an entertainer, right? Like I don't have to say I'm the best player. You got to find some way to make it work, which is what he didn't really do. He just tried to stay at that like status level, even when his play was no longer worthy of it. Now, I will say he is someone I've had my own run-ins with on a personal level, and that has like degraded my respect for him as a person a bit, but I'm not going to get into those now because I don't really want to wreck the guy particularly. I want to make this specifically about the topic at hand, which is how he's being an analyst in Overwatch, because the game I've started watching over the last few months, because I'm going to probably be doing some content in it with Monte Cristo, and as a result, I've watched a lot of different esports and watched all the different analysis desks. And since I work in and doing analysis desks myself and spent a lot of time figuring out how I model the game, it's something that I care about and I want to see people doing a good job on it. So I thought I'd put in my own 2 cents. So the big issue here is, at the end of StarCraft 2, when he wasn't a very good player anymore, he did take on becoming a caster and an analyst in StarCraft 2, and he was on desks there. So the problem is I feel like he's tried to just port his StarCraft 2 persona from analyst desks over to Overwatch. And so my main issue with him, as the title of the video explains, is I don't think he knows his role. I think he hasn't thought about it enough, and I think he's doing the wrong role, a role that doesn't match who he is as a player. So, first of all, in Overwatch, he's not a legitimately world-class player. Now, you wouldn't imagine that necessarily from the way he talks, but okay, you look at his ranks of where he's been, who he's played with, he's like an okay player. I'm talking about for the pro scene here. Obviously, for like average players, he'd shit on them. But for pro players, he's just okay at best. He's not a world-class player. He's someone who I'd better describe as semi-pro. And hence, he's taking his expert analysis and his skills over to the analyst desk instead of playing the game. Okay, makes sense. This is ideal. We want ex-pro type people like this, or people with experience in pro games. That's a great role to fill. The problem is, his StarCraft 2 history, once you take away his Overwatch skills, his StarCraft 2 history doesn't really count for a whole lot in Overwatch. Like, beyond, like, understanding of the psychological aspects of competition, okay, they have value. Understanding training methods, understanding how to match up with someone, and understanding some basic metagame concepts that do apply to every game, okay, sure, that's it. But in terms of, like, expertise on details, the finer details of something, if you're going to present yourself as that expert of, like, mechanics, or how someone played this very specific strategy to this game only that doesn't have a wider metagame concept, you then have to base that only off your expertise in Overwatch. And so that's the problem I see him having there. Is that, on that level, he isn't quite there to where he apparently thinks he is, or at least he portrays himself as being. So, sure, being an ex-pro or being good at this game, that's good, but it's certainly not an automatic route to being a good analyst. Now, and certainly not the best analyst, by the way. Being an analyst is not actually about the direct experience of playing the game or mastering the mechanics with your hands and your eyes, etc. It's about analytical thinking, as the name suggests, as the role suggests. You've got to be able to model the game, the players who play the game, who's the best, what's the hierarchy, how does this player who plays a lesser role for one team is very good at it match up against the best player but on a worse team elsewhere. Matching these things up, the teams, what type of composition of players do they have, what styles do they use, how does that fit in with the players that they have, and then the overall meta game. It's about being able to contrast the skills that people have, the strengths that they have, how these work together, how they complement each other, how they contrast, how they don't work sometimes, how they become one-sided. You've got to figure out specific details and criteria which you're going to focus on to make a specific point and then draw back out of and go in on a different aspect to make a different point. Ultimately, a key detail is you've got to be able to articulate your thoughts. Like, you could be, okay, let's think about this logically. You could be the best player in the world and not speak English very well. Therefore, you would make a terrible analyst in English for Overwatch because you wouldn't be able to articulate properly or with the same sort of way of thinking about life, maybe from your culture, to be able to relate that point to the audience. So articulation, technical skill at speaking and thinking, putting ideas together is actually one of the, I'd say it's like 90% of analysis, not the raw data of like how much you know about the game and how much expert. That's all great. But then unfortunately, I mean, think about it. Here's the analogy for you, okay? It doesn't matter how good the piece of music is that you're playing. If you're playing it through a really shitty speaker and a really poor machine device that isn't properly coding all the frequencies, it's not going to come out great, is it? So this is a key aspect. And then finally, you don't have to do this, but another aspect of how you can be a good analyst is to have some showmanship. To get a game that's not very interesting, that's not too much to analyze in, or there's not too much that's worth going into detail on. Maybe they're two teams that are losing and they didn't play very well, and it's a calamity of errors. And in this area, to be able to insert some showmanship, to still make the show entertaining for people, to put a few jokes in, to keep things going, to maybe funnily make a point about someone that's like fun and just be a joke, and that's a way to keep it a good show so it's not just too dry and too that can be an aspect as well. That's a skill as well. Obviously it's something I put a lot of effort into myself in CSGO, and that's an aspect which the banter school of thinking has as a fallback for when the game itself isn't that great. But when the game's good, always going on what's good in the game and try to keep that other shit to a side thing. I always try to balance it. So if the game's fantastic, it's going to be very little jokes. It's going to be mainly analysis, trying to hit those really good points, work together, get the best out of everyone. If the game's not as good, then there will be a bit of the banter. There will be a bit more jokes. I attenuate that based on how good the game is and how much time we have to fill and what we're going to do with this segment, okay? So the problem here is if HuK was at Overwatch as a pro player, what he was at StarCraft 2 at his prime, it might be doable to take the approach he's taking, where you bill yourself as the ultimate ex-pro / player expert, and that's where your authorities come from. That might work. The problem is, when he sets himself up as that ultimate expert, that doesn't work in Overwatch. It's not working at the moment. That's the big issue. Because, I mean, for a start off, if he actually believed that himself, that he has that expertise and that legitimacy, then why does he keep referencing, like, what other pros think, or, like, he's talked to other people and they would all say the same thing. Like, these appeals to authority, which by the way is a logical fallacy. I mean, I realize he might have thought he was just doing that to reference, like, a lot of other people also think this in case that's interesting to the viewers. That's cool in one sense, but it made it seem like he himself thought that that's like a good way to back up his argument rather than making more points within the argument, or whether articulating it better, or making an interesting analogy to contrast it to something, or pointing something key out that someone can then see as the bigger picture. Instead of doing all that, he just references sort of the logical fallacies. So if you are the ultimate expert, you also don't want to do that, by the way, in terms of setting up your role. You want the ultimate, the authority to be you. And you can say that other people agree. Okay, that could work in a way. I don't think it's as useful, because I don't think you want to take attention away from the fact that you're billing yourself as I know, because I've watched a lot of the games, and here's the detail I've brought down, and here's how I thought about it, and here's how I'm going to put these aspects together, and now it counters what you say in this way, so what do you say to that? You don't need to make it that way. Also, if you're the ultimate expert, you don't have to be kind of as so vulnerable. You don't have to be so worried that this guy has a different opinion and then like battle that guy. I mean, you're the ultimate expert, right? Again, you don't have to tell people you're the best. You are the best in that particular sense. You can. When I say I'm the best, by the way, it's a joke. It's part of the persona. The idea is that is actually the persona I present, and I do it knowing that, again, it's a wink to the audience that, oh, I'm the best, right, guys? But if this guy makes a sick point, yeah, give it up to him, well done, and I give him his space, etc. Even the persona has limits as to how far it goes, right? You don't just ruin the whole show to make the persona super sick. It's like a villain in a movie, right? A villain could be really charismatic and cool, and you know what? Sometimes he has to take a loss. Sometimes he has to let himself look a bit stupid in some sense. He gets his moments of looking cool and all elsewhere. He doesn't just take over the whole movie and ruin the whole fucking thing, right? So yeah, here's the big issue for me. Is that also when HuK's trying to present himself in this super expert role, like, first of all, admittedly, I'm a layman at Overwatch. I don't consider myself an expert, but from my perspective, ZP is the better analyst of the two, actually. I think that he seems to know more. I know he's done a lot more events. Oh, I just followed his EP track. No, I know he's done a lot more events than HuK has. He certainly seems like the guy who, in terms of how he analyzes the game, comes up with more meaningful or interesting or significant points. In general, aside from the fact he fucked that up a little bit and let HuK in through the door, in general, his articulation's a lot better. For me, he's the best native talent I've seen so far. I haven't seen many analysts, obviously, they've only been a couple of lands, but he seems like the best that I've seen at the moment and is doing a good job at that expert role, which I wonder if that's why HuK's then trying to battle him in this fucking weird sense. So here's the stupidest thing about all of this. Because I've already told you on a personal level, don't really like HuK because of some passings that happen. With that said, throw that out the window. I actually think HuK can be a very successful analyst in this game. He could be one of the best. The problem is, he needs to consider the desk balance of where he is. Think about the desk like you think about an Overwatch match, a team game. What is the composition going to be? Who's going to do what right now? Are we both going to play... I mean, I realize this is in the past. Are we both going to play the same character here? Because if you do that, then it can't just be like we're both trying to do the exact same thing at the same point. We're going to have to complement each other even though we're doing the same style. Or are you going to do this style? Am I going to do this style? What's the desk balance going to be? Even within my style, depending on who else I have. How much am I going to go ham at this strength? Or how much am I going to use a little bit of that and use a different strength? You have to have a good balance because it's what the overall product at the end of the day. It's about what the viewer gets to watch at the end. And that has to be a high quality product that works and is meshed together. And even the parts that seem like they're disagreeing and all the rest of it have the fluidity to them. They have a lubrication that makes it all flow within the concept of the show, and it has a harmony and a synergy to what you're doing. So, someone like HuK needs to ask himself and be very, very reasonable and rational in how he does this. Think to himself, what are my strengths? Now, what are the strengths of my co-workers, the people I'm working with? And in doing so, how can we mesh these together? How can they have moments that they don't work together necessarily, but the whole, the Hegelian dialectic or whatever, meets at the top, and then in this scenario, it's a better show, even though it seems like we're at odds and we have friction there. You got to figure out how to do that, because you ultimately have to make a winning composition from it. It doesn't matter that these are two great characters on the right. How are we going to make the winning composition from it? That's the point. So in CSGO, I've had this many times. A great example of probably one of the best combos we have in CSGO right now is myself and Yanko, YNK. Because he's a guy who is an ex-pro, and he is an ex-pro in-game leader even, and he comes at the game from a very analytical perspective, and he has like encyclopedic photographic levels of memory of every round that he's just seen and key moments and how a strat's played out. So guess what? I don't come at him on that role there. I set him up to shine from that position, and I set myself up from the historical perspective, or from expert analysis on grading players, or map veto, or how I think the ideal way to play something is. And I try to get all that, do all my strengths there, and then I work with this guy, and you know what? Sometimes I throw him the alley-oop. If a really good desk combo like this, right, where both people are very good at different aspects, should be like the Miami Heat when Dwayne Wade and LeBron were there, where like one's setting the other one up in the clutch, and then he's taking over for the main early body of the game, or they're throwing alley-oops to each other. It's like you're setting each other up to be the star at the different moments of the game that suit you the best, because it means that you two win the fucking game as a result afterwards. If you remember that Heat team, even though the first year had that sick streak of wins, got to the finals and would have had a chance to win. Likewise, when I work with Flaren, okay, Flaren's someone I banter a lot with, but even so, I take the loss sometimes, or we fuck with each other. It's always in a friendly manner, it's always in a manner. But if he comes from the ex-pro perspective, I don't argue from, like, oh, that's not the case in this particular manner. I know another pro that says it. I argue from my world. I make it from my, and again, there's always that understanding that there's respect, and that it's the overall show. So, as a final point to make here of understanding like your limitations, when I work in CSGO and I do this, and then I go over into League of Legends and I'm a talk show host and I do other things there, in League of Legends, I never present myself as the ultimate expert. I never talk as though that. I talk as though I'm just a layman fan, and that I make it very clear that I don't know the game as well as some of these guys do, but I'm willing to put my opinions out there, and I'm only arguing with them when I'm trying to get more out of them, when I've got time and I've got space where I can incite an interesting opinion and get them to go more in depth, etc. It's never just some dick measuring contest. That's never even the persona I use in League of Legends. So a key detail I see at the moment right now is in how he's presenting himself. It's actually making HuK look like he doesn't have any charisma. Like he doesn't have the charisma to pull off this aggressive attitude that he's taking in this like overly blunt approach. Now, that doesn't mean, when you think that way, that he couldn't do that. Because here's the thing, at the moment, it's just that I feel like it's got too little humour. It doesn't have an obvious friendly element to the banter, and so it doesn't come off as a joke between friends or co-workers. It comes off as something where it's just awkward. That was a fucking cringe fest, that desk. That was terrible to watch. So I actually think at the moment, my advice would be, initially, while you're working your way into the game, play a little bit more of a face role, to use the wrestling terminology. Play a little bit more like you are an ex-pro from a game, or that you are coming from a high-level player perspective and all sort of thing, and make it so that, like, you make your comments about the players, but in terms of how you interact with the desk, start off a little bit more friendly while you're figuring it out still. I mean, I didn't just go super ham at people like back in 2013 or whatever when I first started doing these fucking desks. I had to build up and learn the nuances of when I could do that and how I could do that. Now, I also want to say that you can use this semi-pro status that you have right now, and you can craft that into something that's a very unique role. Like, you're right, the ZP guy doesn't have that. Therefore, you can use that as your role and the parameters of how you're going to build that out. Because in all aspects, think about it, in sports, in StarCraft, in anything in life, when you're trying to compete in some sense, you always have to know what your fundamental strength is. And that's what you're going to ultimately build all your game around. Sure, you might have something that goes away from it or is a counter to it, etc. But it's always going to be able to return back to that core seed of what you're really good at, that fundamental strength. So obviously it was control, it was all-ins in StarCraft 2. That has to be the basis of your game. Then you build the other aspects out. But you have to know what that is to then build the rest of it out. That's the fundament on which you're going to base the rest of it. That's why we call it the fundamentals in these particular areas. So use that semi-pro status, but don't demean or discard this other guy because he's not a semi-pro. That's going to fuck with the whole dynamic of this. You want him to be presented as, sure, he doesn't agree with you, but he has expertise in a different way. And that's why it's going to be great, because it's going to be different. It's going to be diversity of opinion, and we're going to have interesting discussions and a little bit of playful banter, but the product is going to be enlightening, entertaining. It's going to enhance the experience for the viewer, who's going to get a very high quality product at the end of it. So you can disagree, but only to a point. I actually think if you ever watch his old interviews or you ever met the guy, he actually does have charisma. He can be a very likable person on camera. So he needs to consider what his strengths are and how he can channel what is his natural charisma so it comes across better. Because at the moment, it's not coming across. It's getting transmutated. It's going through a prism where, I mean, it could be the prism of his ego that's making him look like an asshole and making people not like him. And even worse, like making people think, oh, why is he fucking with his co-analyst, who most of us think is better, by the way, at the exact role he's trying to do. Why is he doing that? Like, that's ruining things. So the key detail is, as the title says, HuK just needs to know his role better. At the moment, he doesn't know his role. He doesn't seem to understand what his strengths are, what role he's filling, and what role he's in within the composition of his desk. And so as a result, he needs to know his role better as a person to some degree, but mainly as an analyst and as a desk analyst, and work with people, not against them in that sense. Even if you're going to disagree, which is totally fine. Even if you're going to burn them, again, totally fine. You've got to consider how you do it, though.